Winter Storm Fern has fundamentally altered the trajectory of the 2026 winter season. What we witnessed over the past few days represents more than just a devastating weather event. Winter Storm Fern has effectively reset the atmospheric pattern across North America, creating conditions that will dominate the remainder of this winter season in ways that most people don't yet fully understand. The polar vortex collapse that drove this historic storm system has established a new meteorological reality that extends far beyond the immediate damage we're seeing across 22 states. The significance of this pattern change cannot be overstated when we consider what lies ahead for the rest of winter 2026. We're not simply recovering from a single storm and returning to normal winter conditions. The atmospheric disruption that created Fern has locked in place a weather pattern that will persist through February, March, and potentially into early April, fundamentally changing what we should expect from the remainder of this winter season. Understanding how Winter Storm Fern has altered our winter requires examining the broader meteorological forces that this storm has set in motion. The stratospheric warming event that collapsed the polar vortex hasn't simply dissipated now that the immediate storm has passed. Instead, this warming continues to reverberate through the atmosphere, maintaining the disrupted state that allows Arctic air masses to flow freely southward across the continental United States. This ongoing disruption means that the cold air reservoir in the Arctic regions remains accessible to weather systems developing across North America. Under normal winter conditions, the polar vortex acts as a containment system, keeping the coldest air locked in polar regions where it belongs. But with this containment system compromised, we're entering a period where multiple Arctic outbreaks become not just possible, but highly probable over the coming weeks and months. The immediate aftermath of Winter Storm Fern provides clear evidence of this new atmospheric regime. The sustained cold temperatures gripping much of the eastern United States aren't simply the typical post-storm cold that follows most winter weather systems. These temperatures represent the establishment of a persistent pattern that shows little sign of moderating quickly or returning to seasonal norms. Temperature departures from normal across the affected regions are measuring 15 to 25 degrees below average, and long-range forecasting models suggest these departures will persist well into February. This isn't the temporary cold that follows a typical winter storm and moderates within a few days. This represents a fundamental shift in the prevailing atmospheric pattern that will define weather conditions across much of the United States for weeks to come. The infrastructure impacts we are witnessing in the wake of Winter Storm Fern also signal how this changed pattern will affect daily life throughout the remainder of winter 2026. Power grid systems across the southern United States that rarely face sustained Arctic conditions are discovering vulnerabilities that will become recurring challenges as additional cold outbreaks follow in the coming weeks. But this is where the implications of this pattern change extend far beyond what most people are currently considering. The changed atmospheric pattern doesn't simply mean more cold weather is coming. It means that weather systems developing over the next several weeks will have access to temperature contrasts and atmospheric instability that can fuel additional significant storm systems. The sharp boundary between the persistent Arctic air and warmer air masses to the south creates the kind of atmospheric setup that meteorologists recognize as highly conducive to storm development. This temperature contrast zone, known meteorologically as a baroclinic zone, will become a recurring feature of our weather pattern throughout the remainder of winter 2026. Every weather disturbance that moves through this zone has the potential to tap into these strong temperature gradients and develop into significant storm systems. We're not just facing more cold weather, we're facing an atmospheric setup that favors repeated storm development. February emerges as a particularly concerning month when we analyze how this changed pattern will likely evolve. The positioning of persistent high-pressure systems in the Arctic regions, combined with the southward displacement of the jet stream, creates a pattern that meteorologists call a negative Arctic oscillation. This pattern typically persists for weeks or months once established, rather than fluctuating rapidly between different states. Historical analysis of similar negative Arctic oscillation patterns reveals several concerning precedents for what the remainder of winter 2026 might bring. The winter of 2013-2014 featured a similar atmospheric setup following a polar vortex disruption, and that winter produced multiple significant storm systems through February and March, along with sustained below-normal temperatures across much of the eastern United States. That winter season became notorious for its persistence, with Arctic outbreaks continuing well into April across some regions. The winter of 2009-2010 provides another historical analog for our current situation, with a disrupted polar vortex leading to a series of major snowstorms along the eastern United States through February and March of that winter. The infamous Snowmageddon storms that paralyzed the mid-Atlantic region occurred during a similar atmospheric pattern to what we're experiencing now. Those storms demonstrated how a disrupted polar vortex can sustain conditions favorable for repeated major winter weather events. The winter of 1977-1978 offers perhaps the most concerning historical parallel, featuring a polar vortex disruption that established persistent Arctic conditions across much of the United States through February, March, and into early April. That winter season featured multiple major storm systems, sustained energy crises, and agricultural impacts that persisted into the following growing season. These historical precedents suggest that Winter Storm Fern may represent only the beginning of an active and challenging remainder of winter 2026, rather than the climactic event that many people hope it was. The atmospheric conditions that produced Fern remain largely in place, and these conditions favor continued storm development and Arctic air intrusions throughout the coming weeks and months. The geographic implications of this changed pattern extend beyond the regions directly affected by Winter Storm Fern, with particular concerns emerging for March weather patterns that could extend winter-like conditions well into what should be the early spring season. Areas that escape the worst impacts of this particular storm may find themselves in the path of future systems, as the persistent atmospheric pattern continues to evolve through February and potentially into the first half of March. March presents unique challenges under the established atmospheric pattern because it represents the traditional transition period between winter and spring across much of the United States. However, the persistent negative Arctic oscillation pattern could delay this seasonal transition significantly, maintaining winter-like conditions during a month when many regions typically begin experiencing spring warming. The southward displaced jet stream that contributed to Fern's massive scope will continue to guide storm systems along similar tracks in the coming weeks, and potentially through much of March. This persistent storm track favors continued impacts across regions that experience significant effects from Winter Storm Fern. The Ohio Valley, Tennessee Valley, and southeastern United States, which experienced devastating ice accumulations during Winter Storm Fern, remain in a particularly vulnerable position for additional winter weather events. The atmospheric pattern that created the temperature profile responsible for Fern's ice storm conditions shows little sign of shifting northward. New England and the mid-Atlantic states, which received significant snowfall from Winter Storm Fern, also remain positioned under the persistent cold air mass associated with the disrupted atmospheric pattern. Additional storm systems tracking through the established pattern could produce significant snow accumulations across these regions throughout February. But perhaps the most significant implication of this pattern change involves regions that have historically been less susceptible to major winter weather impacts. The Deep South and Gulf Coast states, which experienced rare winter weather during Winter Storm Fern, may find themselves dealing with additional winter weather threats as the pattern persists. The southward extent of the Arctic air mass established by the polar vortex disruption brings temperatures cold enough to support winter precipitation much farther south than typically occurs. This creates the potential for additional winter weather events affecting areas from eastern Texas through the Gulf Coast states and into Florida. These regions lack the infrastructure and experience necessary to handle repeated winter weather events, making each subsequent storm potentially more disruptive. The agricultural implications of this extended winter pattern create concerns that extend well beyond the immediate growing season and could affect food production and pricing throughout 2026. Sustained cold temperatures throughout February and March could delay the onset of spring agricultural activities across much of the United States, affecting planting schedules and growing season length for crops typically planted in early spring. Spring wheat planting across the northern Great Plains typically begins in March and early April, but extended cold conditions could delay planting operations and compress the optimal planting window. Corn and soybean planting operations across the Midwest could face delays if cold conditions persist into traditional spring season. Fruit tree industries across regions affected by the persistent cold pattern face particular challenges from potential late-season freezes that could occur after trees have broken dormancy. Late freezes can cause significant crop losses in fruit production, and the extended cold pattern increases the risk of damaging temperature swings during critical bud break periods. Livestock operations across the affected regions face extended periods requiring additional feed and energy resources to maintain animal health and productivity. The concentrated nature of these impacts across multiple agricultural regions simultaneously could affect food production and pricing throughout 2026. Cattle operations in particular face challenges from extended periods of cold stress, which affects feed conversion efficiency. Dairy operations across the persistent cold zone will experience elevated operating costs from increased energy requirements for barn heating and water system freeze protection. These elevated costs during an extended cold period could affect milk pricing and production levels throughout 2026. Energy infrastructure across the United States will face sustained stress throughout the remainder of winter 2026, as the persistent cold pattern maintains elevated heating demand far longer than typically expected. Natural gas storage levels, already drawn down by Winter Storm Fern's impacts, will face continued pressure from ongoing heating demand through an extended period of below normal temperatures. Electrical grid operators across regions affected by the changed atmospheric pattern must prepare for sustained peak demand conditions rather than the typical winter pattern of brief cold snaps followed by moderate recovery periods. Transportation systems nationwide will need to adapt to a fundamentally different operational environment throughout the remainder of winter 2026. The persistent cold pattern means that winter weather preparation and response procedures may need to remain activated for extended periods. Aviation operations at airports across the central and eastern United States will face ongoing challenges from persistent cold temperatures that affect aircraft performance, ground equipment operation, and fuel system management. The human health implications of this extended winter pattern create public safety concerns that extend well beyond the immediate storm recovery period throughout coming months. Sustained cold temperatures increase the risk of cold-related health problems, particularly among vulnerable populations, including the elderly homeless individuals and those with compromised heating systems following Winter Storm Fern's infrastructure damage. Mental health impacts associated with extended periods of challenging weather conditions, power outages, and restricted mobility create additional concerns for healthcare systems across the affected regions. The prolonged nature of these conditions, extending potentially through March, requires different support strategies than the brief crisis response typically associated with individual storm events. Economic implications of this extended winter pattern affect multiple sectors simultaneously across a wide geographic area. Retail operations face extended periods of reduced customer traffic and increased operational costs associated with heating and snow removal. Construction and outdoor work activities face prolonged restrictions that could delay projects and affect seasonal employment patterns. Tourism and hospitality sectors in regions affected by the persistent cold pattern may experience extended impacts on travel demand and operational costs. Winter sports industries may benefit from extended cold temperatures and snow cover, but transportation challenges could offset some of these benefits if access to recreational areas remains difficult. The implications for the remainder of winter 2026 extend beyond weather and into the realm of emergency management and community resilience, requiring a fundamental shift in how communities prepare for and respond to extended periods of challenging winter conditions. The persistent nature of the challenging conditions requires sustained emergency response capabilities rather than the brief mobilization typically associated with individual storm events. Community support systems, including warming centers, food distribution networks, and emergency services, must prepare for extended activation periods that could strain resources and volunteer availability throughout February and March. The prolonged nature of the challenging conditions requires different planning approaches than brief crisis response typically needed for isolated winter storms. Warming center operations face particular challenges during extended periods of cold weather, as facilities designed for brief emergency activation may struggle to maintain operations for weeks. Staffing, supply, and facility maintenance challenges become more complex when emergency services must operate at heightened levels for extended periods. Food assistance programs may experience elevated demand throughout the extended cold period, as heating costs consume larger portions of household budgets, and transportation challenges affect access to grocery stores. The combination of elevated energy costs and potential supply chain disruptions could create food security challenges for vulnerable populations. Utilities and infrastructure maintenance operations face the prospect of operating under challenging conditions for extended periods, affecting their ability to complete routine maintenance and upgrades that are typically scheduled during milder winter periods. The persistent cold pattern could delay infrastructure improvements and maintenance activities throughout the affected regions, potentially creating vulnerabilities that extend beyond the immediate winter season. Power grid maintenance operations typically scheduled for late winter and early spring may need postponement if challenging weather conditions persist into March. These delays could affect grid reliability during the following summer, creating potential issues that extend the impacts of this winter's atmospheric pattern into subsequent seasons. Educational systems across the affected regions may need to develop strategies for managing extended periods of potential weather-related disruptions. The persistent pattern increases the likelihood of multiple school closure events throughout February and March, requiring different approaches to maintaining educational continuity than the occasional snow day that characterizes typical winters. Supply chain operations across the United States must adapt to a fundamentally altered operating environment throughout the remainder of winter 2026. The persistent challenging conditions across multiple regions simultaneously create ongoing logistics challenges rather than the brief disruptions typically associated with isolated storm events. The changed atmospheric pattern established by Winter Storm Fern represents a meteorological reality that will dominate weather conditions across much of North America throughout the remainder of winter 2026. Understanding this reality allows individuals, communities, and organizations to prepare appropriately for what promises to be an extended period of challenging winter conditions. This winter season will be remembered not just for Winter Storm Fern itself, but for how that storm fundamentally altered the atmospheric pattern and established conditions that persisted throughout the remainder of the season, creating challenges that extended far beyond any single weather event.